but I'm sure it will come out somewhere.
Yeah, Oxford academics. They never had children. They both had how can I say? They had an intense interest in childcare. Barbara Kahan,
for some reason,
and
for some unknown reason yet,
and her husband, who was a child psychiatrist, Vladimir Khan.
Yeah.
We believe he's part of the brain drain from Russia at that time. Anyway, they married.
Psychiatrist.
Yeah, he's a Tavistock and Home Office psychiatrist. Anyway, they worked together, and they married in 1955. And it was Barbara Kahan who was a pioneer in the field of child welfare and residential, specifically in residential care. And it was her. It was her who legitimized Peter Wrighton's academic sort of respect, academic credence, as it were, or credibility within the child welfare and social services sort of profession. So it was that unholy alliance between Vladimir Khan, a Tavistock Home Office child psychiatrist, Barbara Kahan, pioneering child welfare worker,
connected with Home Office,
and Peter Wrighton, and Peter Wrighton, government with other government connections, Peter Wrighton, and so it was this unholy alliance that formulated and formed the guidelines for the development of child welfare and residential child care throughout the last 50, 60 years. And this is why the cult has been able to have such control, because these three, whilst they may not be responsible for this epidemic of child sacrifice and sodomy, they greatly facilitated this plague through their, as I say, formulation of child welfare and child residential care policies.
Because Peter Wrighton is a known paedophile, isn't he? I mean, he got caught at the school that he was teaching at. He's a friend with Charles Napier.
Absolutely, yeah, he got Charles Napier. He got Charles Napier a job. He got him a plum job after he'd been convicted. And, and he got another.
The address was 5 to 9 Tavistock Place.
That's the one. And he got another guy, another doctor. What's his name? I think it was Morris, another paedophile, to endorse his reference of Napier. But let's get back to Wrighton and see Wrighton. She says, see what made us suspect Kahan ultimately is that she says that she had no idea. She had no idea, and he hoodwinked her. She believed that he was homosexual, as he enjoyed a homosexual relationship. He had a live-in partner, and she believes that he was homosexual. But this was a time. This was in the 70s, a time of new liberal ideals, as it were. And it would appear that the climate was such that, nobody challenged his philosophy, as it were.
There's nothing new about paedophilia, but I believe the particular problems we face today have their roots in the 1960s and 70s. In amongst all the good things brought by the sexual revolution, a dangerous new group emerged. They called themselves the Pedophile Information Exchange, or PI for short, and wanted sex with children to be legalized. They'd even had the gall to argue their case on Newsnight.
A child is able to recognize a pleasurable experience. He is able to recognize a pleasing emotional experience. He is able to express consent and to recognize that this is something he wishes to continue. And a responsible, caring pedophile, it always refers to the wishes of the child.
PI enabled pedophiles to get organized. And it wasn't just information they exchanged.
These men were paedophiles seeking other paedophiles. Pi published a magazine, Magpie, and later its members published another magazine called Minor Problems. Both of these magazines served as contact points for paedophiles. They served as a way for paedophiles to exchange child pornography and in some cases locate children to abuse.
In what now seems like a moment of madness, Pi was actually taken seriously. They submitted evidence to a Home Office inquiry regarding the age of consent laws and were linked to the National Council for Civil Liberties at a time when Harriet Harman and Patricia Hewitt were senior members.
If today an organisation had said, men should be free to have sex with children at whatever age and we're campaigning for this, they would be howled down. They would not be allowed anywhere near the corridors of power and influence. Pi was.
Because of Pi's success, paedophiles helped each other to infiltrate our institutions and gain access to our children, especially in schools and residential care homes, making the problem even worse. So what did we do to try and stop it, and why didn't it work?
Or his ideas regarding sex with children. He regularly wrote, and he spoke freely amongst his colleagues regarding his sexual proclivities and his feelings.
Well, say it seems to be quite a few of them were doing it at the time within the government.
Well, he was writing extensively. Look, it goes on. It's part of their culture.
He's a founder of Pi.
He's also he's a founding member of Pi. I know his membership number is 51. So it looks like he was possibly the 51st.
And he's fully participated in the in advising Barbara Kahan in formulating the practices and policies
for the
childcare
and particularly residential care.
And it looks like they were targeting vulnerable children.
Definitely targeting vulnerable children.
And all this referencing, it took place, like
pedophile
referencing other pedophile to get into school and into care,
into schools and into care home
institutions.
And this is why we have the epidemic that we have now, because they've had half a century.
And they laid the foundation.
They've had 50 years to insinuate and place their colleagues, their cult colleagues, their sodomite colleagues within strategic positions, within social care and child welfare now, and social services specifically, because this was all of these were like the ancestors of social services, this child welfare.
They set up a lot of charities as well, don't they?
Yes, because
taking
these
kids out,
academics.
on special days and stuff like that, and sailing.
Absolutely. Well, yes.
That's the Azimuth.
The Azimuth Foundation and that. Yes.
Yeah,
well, look, these are academics. These are Oxford academics.
Wrighton was a senior government advisor on childcare, a man in a position of great trust. They both knew Charles Napier, a diplomat who was jailed this summer for sexually abusing boys. A network of paedophiles is operating here and abroad.
It's not as if paedophiles meet regularly at a set venue, like a sort of a club, but the information that passes between paedophiles on the phone, passing pornography back and forth to each other, knowing of another paedophile, knowing who it's safe to contact, is extremely well organised.
Maurice Fraser and Terence Waters have continued to offend each time they've been released from prison. Mike Johnson may be released as early as next month. Once out of prison, no one keeps track of these men. And though paedophiles receive treatment in prison, Fraser and Waters are proof it doesn't always work.
There's no doubt that, particularly untreated, people like him will go on offending because their fantasy is directed towards sex with children.
And, they're considered the brightest brains in the country. And they're formulating the guidelines for child welfare. You know,
So
why?
basically, paedophiles are telling us how we need to bring up our children.
Absolutely, exactly.
They're making it easier for themselves to gain access.
To gain access to vulnerable children, and these are the very same ones. Barbara Kahan was instrumental in outlawing corporal punishment in the 50s, early in the 50s. You know, we were still getting the cane in my school, in the 70s. So I don't know what happened there, but
the first steps towards declaring that that the physical punishment of the children is a crime, and this is it triggers the social services, allows social services to take your children, and so it looks like these people been employed by the government. Barbara Kahan was introduced into the close circle of the English Queen.
Oh, she's a member of Privy Council. I forgot to mention that. Yes, Barbara Kahan.
And
definitely
so these people, they looks like the social services was established to actually carry out the job for those elite members.
And so people in his position are clearly a danger to children.
And I feel betrayed and really annoyed, and that they've taken some privacy away from me.
John Kiddie reporting.
I can't forgive anybody who threatens a child, forces them to do things they don't want to do. It's wrong.
To snatch the children, to introduce them and to sodomize them, and also to get the children for the sacrifices. And what we're experiencing now is what been so done.
The seeds that were sown then
now is bearing fruits.
Bearing the fruits of Koram, Tavistock and Kafkas and social services as an unholy alliance in the cause of industrialized, institutionalized child snatching. All right, so they're stealing children on an industrial scale. They have quotas. They have quotas of children that they must have up for adoption, and they're stealing children and selling them to the highest bidders.
Oh yeah, it's big business, isn't it? Fostering.
And but what is really surprising, and for me as an outsider of the society, is how for 50-60 years the people didn't know anything was going on in the children homes. I mean,
Ella, people knew.
The mother of one of Mike Johnson's victims. For legal reasons, we can't identify her. Her life was all but destroyed when her son finally explained what happened.
And he came back in, and I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Oh, I don't want to tell you." I said, "Well, come on, you can't do that. You've got to tell me. I've waited, I've been patient, I want to know." And he said, "Mike was sexually abusing me, and at least one other child." And I was just totally stunned.
Among Mike Johnson's other innocent victims are his own family, living now in France in self-imposed exile.
We haven't got any money. We've had to sell the house, we've had to sell the boat, and I mean, financially it's an absolute disaster, and it's just destroyed anything or everything that we've set up, really.
Roger Michael Johnson began his teaching career in 1971. 3 years later, he was promoted to a teacher's centre at Foy Hall. His love of boats and sailing were well known. He even built his own 48-foot schooner. By 1986, Johnson had moved on to become a support teacher at the Outdoor Education Centre in St Justin, Roseland. Here, he ran sailing courses for children. He used his own schooner to take children to sea in groups. The hard-working, dedicated Johnson was much respected by colleagues and by children, but there was a darker side. Stephen Green and his friend Darryl Marshall jumped ship after one violent incident.
we were sailing back from the Scillies. It was a late one of the nights. I was helming the boat on the compass course, but the bearing was too high and I couldn't steer it. There was no steerage on the boat. And then we had a log out the back of the boat as well, which got entangled in the rudder when I tapped the boat twice. And he tried to untangle it, and then he started hit me on the back. It was hard, and it's right in the middle of my back as well.
Show me how did he hit you?
Well, he just smacked right on my back, and I had bruised to prove it as well.
Were you scared?
Yeah, I was scared.
Stefan and Daryl were both interviewed by a social worker who reported his findings to County Hall. At a disciplinary hearing, Johnson admitted physical assault. The details of this were kept secret. No one outside County Hall was told that there were any reservations about Mike Johnson. Much more seriously, there were also allegations of sexual assault on 2 other boys, one on his yacht, the other in France during a stopover. The same social worker interviewed the victims and was convinced the assault had happened.
Those allegations were not found proven.
Why?
I wasn't at the hearing. I couldn't say. All I can say is that the hearing had evidence presented by both sides and came to the conclusion, having heard all the evidence.
People knew, but nothing been done about it.
But people knew, but they was threatened with their jobs, or maybe they had something else they could blackmail them with. Or...
Obviously, they've been given a lot of powers.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously, you know, they look trustworthy, don't they? They look trustworthy, they sound trustworthy, and a lot of this is based on honesty. You know, everything's based on honesty and trust. But now you can't trust no one.
How can you trust it? Look, it's part of the culture. These public schools, the right of sodomy is an integral part of their passing through the public schools.
Yeah, it looks like that way. Yeah.
And this is just a continuation of that culture. And so
to get anywhere in power, it looks like you had to have gone through something like that.
Yeah, but to know, but to discover, the only reason we discovered the Barbara Kahan connection was because they, rather arrogantly, they've used Barbara Kahan's name in their money laundering operations.
Oh, no.
The social worker who took the statement from children was convinced that the children were telling the truth, and yet obviously his evidence at that hearing was not accepted. Why?
I wasn't at the hearing, and I can't say. I can only repeat what I have just said.
Well, who was at the hearing? Who could answer that question?
The hearing was confidential in the sense that all proceedings so far as discipline inside the County Council are confidential. That is a normal practice, I think you would find.
Again, the allegations against Johnson were kept secret. Not even headmasters who recommended Johnson's sailing trips were told there were any doubts about his behaviour. John Lambert says he sent his son off with Johnson on the recommendation of a head teacher.
This recommendation I was very glad to receive. That recommendation effectively gave at least an educational recommendation. And being that the headmaster is employed as a county employee, I presume that Johnson is held in high regard by that organisation.
Johnson's bosses held him in such high regard that he was promoted to become the head of the Roseland Centre in 1990. Here, he had even greater access to children.
It's a strange sort of discipline that debars anybody from ever doing another job or doing a good job subsequent. The whole purpose of a disciplinary procedure is to make people improve.
But he didn't improve. The disciplinary hearing ordered Johnson not to use his yacht for any county council purpose. He ignored the warning, and we have evidence that he used his position at Roseland to promote the very sailing trips which had led to allegations of sexual abuse. Had the county council checked their own files, they would have discovered that Mike Johnson's first job was as an assistant teacher at a school in Falmouth. A senior colleague there was sacked after allegations of child sexual abuse. The pair worked together for 3 years. In 1988, less than a year after that disciplinary hearing, Johnson began to set up the sailing charity which was to be known as the Azimuth Trust. Unknown to the parents who helped, one of the founding trustees was a convicted child pornographer. Roderick Morris Fraser is a psychiatrist who at one time counselled children damaged by bombing in Northern Ireland. He met Johnson through a French sailing group called École en Bateau, of which he was a director. The group takes children on long sailing trips. From letters we've obtained, Fraser was clearly the driving force behind Azimuth. He even chose the name.
I have been thinking about the names, and myself see it this way. The organisation would be Azimuth, Adventure and Education Afloat, and the publication would be Seaborn.
A questionnaire was sent out to children wanting to join the expeditions aboard Johnson's new yacht, the Grace O'Malley. Fraser was deeply involved in the early stages and in selecting children.
They have got the questionnaire and I've suggested they fill it in, and then I will send it to you, after which trial visits may be possible. I've asked that the questionnaires be returned soon.
Child psychologists who studied the questionnaire say in the right hands it could be used to discover which children were vulnerable to abuse.
Innocent. Then they picked the camera people up first, went off to Amsterdam to get supplies and stuff and pick up.
And then you went to the Isle of Wight to pick up David Icke.
As much as you can, because we are announcing this publicly, big time today.
What kind of bizarre things?
Went off to Amsterdam to get supplies and stuff and pick up.
And then you went to the Isle of Wight to pick up David Icke. And he got on that boat.
He was on that boat 100%.
And there were disabled children on that
I know,
boat
mate.
Going,
right? So what he says is that... I know, right? He says he gets picked up from Amsterdam with filming equipment on Charles Napier's boat with the Azimuth Trust. They come over to the Isle of Wight and pick you up. You get on the boat, and then on the boat there's disabled kids and stuff, and you're having sex with one of the disabled kids, and also you supposedly have sex with Andrew in one of the cabins, right?
Right. Where on that boat did you have sex with David Icke?
Fraser, the psychiatrist, was precisely qualified to know. Those who met him had reservations.
I thought he was odd. I didn't like his attitude towards boys, but still I thought he must be another philanthropist. He's in Azimuth. He helps with the children. It did seem strange that he took children away occasionally and lots of them stayed at his house. It seemed strange once or twice that I went there. I was only ever asked into the kitchen, never into the living room or the normal kind of places in a house you're asked into.
In April last year, Fraser was jailed for possession of child pornography. He was released in June and returned to Cornwall and to Azimuth. More worrying still is the fact the General Medical Council, the doctors' governing body, have not struck him off and have no plans to do so.
Please sit. Morning everyone and welcome to day 10 of this public hearing. Mr O'Connor.
Good morning, Chair. Our first witness this morning is Kenneth Clark.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Can you give your full name, please?
Kenneth Clark. Well, my full name's Kenneth Harry Clark.
I want to ask you about how that was done. There's an idea, perhaps in the public imagination, that there is what's sometimes known as a dirt book in the whip's office, where all this information is carefully stored away. And you talk about something similar to that in your book.
Yeah. There was a dirt book or a black book, yes, which you reported things which you thought might be of interest to the Chief Whip in particular, and your colleagues. And it was kept in the cupboard, and you would put an entry in it so if you picked up something interesting, and actually you could read it if you wanted to. As a whip, you could sometime during the day or the week, or at least during the week, pick it up and read it. So you caught up with what your colleagues had recorded, and again, the purpose of that was to share the information we've got. I mean, so a lot of entertaining nonsense surrounds the work of a whip's office. I went to a theatrical production recently about life in the Labour whip's office. I forget what it was called. It was quite a good play, but it did rather imitate American soap opera. The idea that everybody spends their entire time shouting at each other, and the whole thing is riddled with all sorts of bizarre scandals, and that whips spend their time blackmailing their colleagues to get their political support, is complete, Mickey Mouse nonsense. It's a very political gathering, and half the time you pick up the information just because of the fact you all have a whip's office, you all meet at least once a day, we'd all gather, and you just share a lot of gossip, and you know your friends. And the way you deal with members is rather just listening sympathetically and trying to encourage them to be loyal and trying to get someone, trying to answer their doubts about what you're doing. And it's not like these daft American soap operas that give the impression the whole thing's people walking around bawling at each other and losing their temper.
Let's turn to Tim Fortescue, and perhaps we can play the clip. You may not be aware, Mr. Clark, but it was a documentary in 1995.
I'd never heard of it until you wrote to me about it and approaching me.
Well, it wasn't an American soap opera, but it was a BBC documentary.
So I gather.
Called Westminster's Secret Service. It's INQ 004083.
That sounds like, again, a rather sensational description.
Well, let's see what Mr. Fortescue told the BBC. Perhaps we can play the clip, please.
Anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth and say, "No, I'm in a jam. Can you help?" It might be debt. It might be a scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we could help. And if we could, we did. And we would do everything we can, because we would store up brownie points. That sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons. Is if we can get a chap out of trouble, then he'll do as we ask forevermore.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Clark, you can see, I'm sure, how Mr. Fortescue's reference to small boys and the whips having information about
I realised when I read the transcript of
and small boys is something that's going to cause a lot of concern.
Yeah, how far he thought that through, I mean, I have no idea what he's talking about, because I don't remember a problem with any member of Parliament with small boys in my time in the office. He was in the office for longer than me. I was only there for 2 years, and he was there before I arrived, so unless something had happened before I arrived, I don't remember anything to do with small boys. The main thing that was a lurking possible problem in those days, because we're talking about 50 years ago, a different culture, when homosexuality was illegal and homosexuality was deeply disapproved of and was thought to be shocking by sections, certainly of the establishment and the bourgeois population, and not surprisingly, there were quite a few homosexual people in the House of Commons, although one right-wing member once caused great amusement by saying he'd never met one, but it caused open laughter when he said that in a debate. It was more the homosexual, the gay people who were at risk of getting into trouble and being betrayed. They all had to keep it a deadly secret. Life is very much better now. We have a quite different culture. We have plenty of gay members of Parliament, not many, but quite a significant minority. And nobody bothers tuppence, and they all come out. But the homosexual ones were probably the ones most at risk of scandal in those days.
Well, we've heard a fair amount of evidence about those ambiguous...
The council refused us an interview. 4 months ago, Fraser got work in Dorset and then Southampton. He ended up here at this hospital as a locum psychiatrist. Following our phone call to the health authority, they checked with the police and discovered that Dr. Fraser was indeed a convicted child pornographer. They then sacked him. It now transpires that when we called them, they were considering giving him a full-time job as a consultant psychiatrist. Fraser lives in a block of flats in the Shirley area of Southampton. He wasn't pleased to see us.
I've nothing to say to you.
About setting up Azimuth, Dr. Fraser?
I've nothing to say to you.
Why did you set it up? Did you design the questionnaires for the children?
Nothing to say.
Why did you set Azimuth Trust up? What was the idea behind it? To kill children, was it? Doctor? You've nothing to say to the families back in the West Country who you betrayed? Hiding in his flat, Dr. Fraser waited for us to leave. Instead, we tried again to get answers. You must surely regret what you've done, Dr. Fraser, don't you?
I didn't do anything.
You went to prison last year for possession of child pornography.
That's incorrect.
You were sent to prison at Southwark Crown Court in April last year, Dr. Fraser.
It's a matter of record.
So it's correct?
It's a matter of record.
Why won't you face people who want to hear answers from you, Dr. Fraser? Don't you think you owe it to people, to parents, whose children's lives have been ruined by people like you? Fraser is still legally allowed to practice as a doctor with the General Medical Council's blessing. Following our investigation, the case is now being taken to the government.
I think we need to know that professional conduct committees and the General Medical Council are there to protect us, the public, and they're to protect us against those who have clearly been identified as undertaking actions which would worry even the most naive person.
US terms, boys, rent boys, and as you say, in that time, that didn't necessarily mean children at all. But just to go back to Mr. Fortescue, he did use the words small boys, which perhaps is a lot less ambiguous. But did you, during your time in the Whip's office, ever come across any scandal?
Blatantly. Not dissing the guy, and if he was sexually abused or assaulted, well, I don't believe that story. He started bringing all sorts of people into it. Tom Cruise, and this one made it really fucking fantastical. And then the strange thing about it, if I can find it, is what you would know Ben Fellows for mainly. 8 years ago, Labour leader was called for Ken Clarke to resign after rape in a radio interview. Ben Fellows discusses. Ben Fellows exposes Ken Clarke as a paedophile and explains his disappearance to Gun. Right? Ben Fellows, Ken Clarke, the big beast of the British politics. Right, now this don't make any sense. Ben Fellows wins court case against Kenneth Clarke. Right, so, oh, here we go. Look, here he is. Here he is, look. Guidance. Westminster child abuse wins at Old Bailey against Kenneth Clarke. We didn't win, he was just found not guilty. So if Ben Fellows is found not guilty, that must mean Kenneth Clarke was guilty, mustn't it? If Ben Fellows is found not guilty through alleging that Kenneth Clarke had sexually abused him, what does that mean? Ben Fellows, the accuser, is not guilty over his allegations of Ken Clarke abusing him or touching him. To me, that says Ben won. If Ben won, Kenneth Clarke wouldn't still be in power, would he? And he would have gone to prison, and Kenneth Clarke would have been found guilty. But we've had no such. We've had no such news. Here we go. Have a look at this. So if I pull that onto there, oh, wicked. That's an easier way to do it. There you go.
About small boys.
I mean, to the best of my recollection, but I would have remembered it, and it would have been quite a problem, I think. I would have regarded as that, although as a junior member of the office, if I discovered somebody who was sexually molesting children, And I thought I would remember it if we had one. But as I said when I was approached about that, no idea what Tim was talking about. And although I lost touch with him after he left the house.
And that they are prepared to undertake that responsibility clearly and on our behalf.
When Mike Johnson met Fraser, he may not have known that Fraser has an international group of paedophile friends. One who got involved early in Azimuth is now the subject of a police inquiry. The others aren't. We have letters from men in Spain, France, Switzerland and America. The names of British men we believe could be paedophiles have been given to Scotland Yard's Obscene Publications Squad. There is no international body tracking paedophiles. They're not easy to spot and they can be very plausible.
The first thing you've got to be, if you want to be a successful paedophile, is to be good at whatever you do. The second thing is you need to really be able to actually spot children who are vulnerable for whatever reason. And the average paedophile may actually meet hundreds and hundreds of children, but actually only make an approach to one or two. And it's the one or two vulnerable ones that they're very skillful in picking out.
But he looks older and greyer, and I wondered whether he was just being casually talking, but he looks as though he's talking quite seriously, but whether he really thought through the example he chose, or whether it was because the morning he gave the interview there'd been a case involving small boys in the newspapers, I've no idea, but I have absolutely no recollection. And looking back, of the members of Parliament, our members of Parliament at that time, I can't remember any gossip or anything about, as it happens, small boys. A paedophile will be, I think, have been really rather strongly disapproved of, and would have found the House of Commons a difficult place to work if we'd had one.
As you say, you were only in the Whip's office for a couple of years.
Yeah.
But what do you say then about how likely it is that something like this might have happened in the years after you left it?
Well, the turnover of the House of Commons is quite brisk. There are over 600 members. I must by now have served alongside probably thousands of people as members of Parliament. I have to, it would be astonishing if amongst those there weren't one or two paedophiles.
The parents who were duped by Johnson are angry. They trusted him because he was a teacher who gave the impression he had county council approval. The county council indeed gave Azimuth a grant, as did other public bodies. They want to know why Johnson's past was kept secret. They want to know why he was promoted at Roseland when there were already serious doubts about him. And they want to know why Johnson was still receiving job applications from Cornwall County Council as late as April this year.
And later, after I was in the Whip's office, there were, of course, rumours. There were rumours about 2 or 3 members, with the exception of Cyril Smith, none of which I was altogether believed. The trouble with people were going for this kind of gossip, and it is Whip's office, it's gossip we're talking about, is once someone starts getting gossiped about in some sexually scandalous way, it gets repeated. It never actually stops. People who enjoy gossip just relate it to somebody else, and it soon becomes established fact. So, in modern times, I think the allegations about Leon Britton and Ted Heath were just ludicrous, but you found people who believed them. Going back in times, Peter Morrison, Greville Janner, as far as I'm aware, no one ever established there was any substance to them. It's just once 2 or 3 people start gossiping, all the people who like to pretend they're in the know just repeat it. And of all those, Cyril Smith, it's now public knowledge that he obviously was a paedophile. I think the idea that Leon and Ted Heath were is just ludicrous. And I suspect, I have no idea whether Peter was, but I very, very much doubt it.
Ironically, this list includes one for a social worker specialising in child abuse.
I can only assume that the county did not wish it to be known. I can think of no reason why they didn't wish that to be known, other than they had re-employed him, and I consider that to be very dubious, to say the least.
The charity Kidscape also wants answers. A major loophole in the law needs to be closed.
I think it's a bizarre loophole in the law. I think that anyone who has ever been convicted of abusing children should be banned for life from ever working in any capacity with children.
All right, Mr. Clark, let me ask you about Cyril Smith. You mentioned about Cyril Smith. The inquiry have heard what they've heard about his case now, but
I read it in the newspaper this morning. Yes.
Let me ask you about what you remember hearing back when he was alive in the House of Commons. What do you remember hearing about him then?
Well, when we were at the Whip's office, he was in that Parliament. He arrived in a by-election in my first Parliament. And at first he was a jovial, larger-than-life character. We all thought he was a great, you know, he was literally larger than life, and he was full of bonhomie and all the rest of it. This slightly wore off, because politically he was actually rather wily and cunning, and he slowly gathered on he wasn't quite just the jovial, nice chap you appeared. But I was I wasn't a police officer that, I was, you know, shadow minister and things. I just, with the public, followed the emerging gossip in the newspapers and the allegations against him, and it's actually discovered, and I think it is established now, that he plainly had engaged in a lot of paedophile activity, which of course put him into total disgrace.
Right, so you didn't hear any rumours other than those that
I don't
were
think
in the
that
press?
first part, when Tyrrell was a new member of Parliament, he was just a great big fat jolly chappie. I don't think at that time, I don't know whether there are any suspicions in Rochdale, but as far as I can recall, none of them had reached Westminster by then.
All right.
And that, I mean, even as a coach driver who might transport children, a school caretaker, you'd be amazed at how good these people are at getting into jobs where they can get near children. We also ban people from driving automobiles. It seems to me that animals and automobiles are important, but children are vital, and it's stupid that we don't pass a law like this.
Liz Johnson and her 2 children are now trying to rebuild their lives in France. Liz stayed with their boat after it was sold, but she has since been sacked by the sailing group which now owns the vessel. La Belle and Blanche, the white whale, is desperate not to be tarred with the same brush of paedophilia. With no home and no job, she is left to contemplate a life spent with a man who had deceived her, possibly for years.
I didn't know, and I didn't realise that it was, you know, it was any deeper than that, really.
Did Mike confess to you, or what?
No, the relationship that he had, or thing, I mean, it affected the whole family. He didn't need to confess, or, you know, and the other ones I mean, I found out through what other people have said, not through what he said, and I mean, it's difficult to ask somebody you trust, because, I mean, if you find out, it hurts, and I mean, I suppose I was trying to avoid...
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I was probably avoid. I mean, I was, having had a lot of upset and hurt before, I was probably trying to avoid any more.
Let me just ask you a little bit more about some of the suggestions made by Mr. Fortescue in that clip. He said, for example, that MPs might come to the whips because they had financial problems, because they were in debt.
Yeah.
Is that something you remember?
Yes, I can't remember particular examples. I genuinely can't, because we're going back nearly 50 years. I think that, well, I think I know that happened once or twice. I mean, apart from anything else, apart from, as Tim says, getting the gratitude of a colleague who you thought was probably more receptive to the whip's advice if you helped him out. I mean, I was too junior to be directly involved in the actual helping out of anybody with financial trouble. But you had to avoid by-elections. We didn't, certainly in the second half of the Heath government, we didn't want any by-elections. And you know, there was also a responsibility, going back to 50 years ago, the boys' club atmosphere of politics in the House of Commons, in which a few women managed to survive in this very strange, rather St. James Club type atmosphere the place had.
And if he couldn't trust me by telling me, then, you know, I mean, I felt that, you know, it was difficult to ask.
I think I understand that point. I mean, if someone you trust and you love confesses half the truth to you, you don't want to hear the rest, is that right?
Yeah, and also, I mean, if they confessed a certain amount, you then have to still believe that they're telling you the truth. And if they aren't, I mean, it breaks the whole relationship and things down anyway.
I asked Liz to come back to England to face the families whom her husband had betrayed. She said she might come back, but not until she's had time to think. The legacy Mike Johnson and other paedophiles leave behind is a long and appalling one.
We used to think that it was the minority sort of abuse. I think some of us are now beginning to think that maybe it's actually up at the same level as physical abuse is.
You know, you helped colleagues out, and a few very wealthy members of Parliament, because we had the landed gentry and so on still represented in the 1970s, probably would step in and just help somebody through his problems. They weren't very well paid in those days, and some of the members were skint, some were also a bit foolish.
And what about the suggestion that's implicit in what Tim Fortescue said, that there was a quid pro quo, that if the whips helped a member out, whether it's money or, to use his word, a scandal involving small boys, then that information would or help would somehow be used to secure the MP's loyalty?
Well, you put the word used in. There's in no way of forcing any, that's as the government's discovering at the moment, there's no way of forcing any member of Parliament to say or vote in any particular way. But someone you'd helped out would indeed be extremely likely, I'd have thought, to feel grateful to the whips and sometimes politically reluctantly do what the whips helped. Again, people who write TV sort of soap operas put that in a kind of blackmailing way. Now, I don't think that was the style of Francis Pym and Humphrey Atkins and Michael Jopling and these people. But you know, it would be a pretty bizarre character if he'd been bailed out, spent the next 12 months rebelling against the whips on some significant issue that was not likely to happen. And that was one of the motives. And Tim had got cynical as he got older, I think, on the thing, but it's not the only motive for doing it. And it, I say, people give it this, the very word whips office conjures up, you know, sinister men twisting arms and so on, which is a slightly comic parody of a perfectly straightforward political activity.
Let me just push you on that just a little bit. I mean, we can all understand what you say, and that if someone has been helped out, they'll be grateful, and that might tip the balance between supporting and not supporting.
But that's not the only reason for helping him.
No, but if the Whip's office have gained lots of some personal information about someone, let's say they're having an affair, let's say their marriage is breaking up, was there ever a sense in which the suggestion might have been made that if they didn't stay loyal, this information might be released or might gain further coverage?
Never. I mean, that would be a dreadful thing to do. No, I really, the man you show on the photograph didn't behave like that. And actually, certainly Francis Pym would not have run that sort of Whip's office. That is soap opera fiction, that version of how it worked, certainly in the Whip's office in my short experience.
Now, as you say, Mr. Clark, it was a short experience, 2 years.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. It was a pretty full experience because I was every day in the House of Commons.
Many years ago. But you have, of course, you haven't been back to the Whip's office, but you have been in the House of Commons ever since.
Yeah.
And no doubt dealing with the Whips, even if you're not privy to their private conversations. In general, do you have can you help us with whether the position has changed, whether the way they go about their work has changed over the years, and the sort of questions I've been asking, whether the answers are any different for the period following your time in the Whip's office?
Well, of course, obviously I don't know, but actually I know several of the Whips. I'm quite good terms with several of the Whips, despite the fact at the moment I'm just made it clear I don't actually agree with the government's policy on things, and I'm so therefore a bit of a serial rebel at the moment. But I'm sort of on perfectly good terms with the Whips. I go and have meals with them occasionally. And if they gossip about their office, I think it's on the whole quite similar. The House of Commons has changed and the culture has changed. The sort of people in the House of Commons are a much broader range of people now, and and so a lot of things have changed, and people's values and judgments and all that. The culture has changed since 50 years ago. The actual way the Whip's office is organised, the things it does, there every hour, the day how the House is sitting. It doesn't sit so long now. and this collection of information and being the eyes and ears, that's absolutely the same.
That's the
as
same.
As far as I can judge, only from my conversations with the current whips that I know.
But can you also help us with how the current whips, or for that matter the whips in the 80s and 90s, would have reacted to coming across information about child sex abuse?
Well, as this inquiry knows, looking back, if you go back 50 years, it is difficult to explain looking back. There obviously was a different culture. Paedophilia was always disapproved of, I mean, fiercely disapproved of, but it was, prosecution for it was rare compared with today. It was kind of associated with a tiny minority of professions which attracted paedophiles, teachers, scoutmasters, priests. And looking back, there's a curious and mystifying thing that people try to stop them, but nothing would be done, and they wouldn't be reported. The school I was at had one teacher who every pupil knew was a paedophile. I mean, he never molested me. I was lucky, but I don't think he molested many people. But now I talk to people at school, we all knew we got this one chap who got any sense you kept out of the way of. Now, how, to somebody in 2019, it is utterly inexplicable that a very smart school that actually regarded itself as a Christian school, upright school, did nothing whatever about this man. It just wasn't put on the same basis. Now, the disapproval was severe, so it is, it's one of the things that you're inquiring into. They should have been. I don't think people appreciated quite what lasting damage it did to the victims, but it wasn't a cover-up exactly. It wasn't a conspiracy, but it was just not. The law was, for some peculiar reason, not enforced properly. Now, and I think most of the politicians of my generation coming in, I wouldn't have covered up for a paedophile if I'd found one of the people in the Parliament was a paedophile. If I'd discovered that the Whip's office knew and were doing nothing about it, I don't know what I'd have done. I'd have regarded that as quite a serious, moral dilemma. What I'm going to do if we were all proposing not to do anything about this guy. But, that's just change in culture. I had a liberal 1960s type approach to these things, but that didn't extend to paedophilia. Whereas my views, when it came to the homosexuals, was I was quite prepared to, wouldn't disclose that to anybody because I couldn't quite see why it was a criminal offence, and the sexual activities of someone who happened to be gay was nothing to do with me, was my view. So you've got to be careful about applying the judgments and the culture of 2019 to 50 years ago, when, for some reason, the judgments of the generations that preceded me were totally different.
But you've described a culture not of today, but of 50 years ago, in a school, for example, where, as you put it, everyone knew that someone was a paedophile.
All the boys knew,
but no one reported it, no one did anything about it.
I suspect that the staff must, over the years, have known, but for some peculiar reason, probably because of the threat to the reputation of the school. But even then, you could have quietly got him at least to leave, but they didn't.
That's another story. But what I want to ask you is why shouldn't the same circumstances, why shouldn't the same situation have arisen in Parliament, where everyone knew that someone was a paedophile, but no one did anything about it, possibly to save reputations?
Well, from my knowledge, it never did. I don't think Parliament would have been very attractive to a paedophile to join them, although I'm sure, as I've already said, that being astonishingly statistically, if there had never been a paedophile in the House of Commons throughout my time, we know there was one. Cyril Smith, I think there is undoubtedly quite sufficient evidence that he was. but I'm sure there were more who went undetected, but not many. But to actually be discovered some evidence that someone was a paedophile, or I think it would have been quite a serious matter just to cover that up.
And what
I
do you think
would have been very unhappy.
And what do you think you would have done?
To that, but that.
And the much more worrying thing about sexual abuse is it's so much more difficult to find out about, and therefore, unlike broken bones and bruises, very much more difficult to treat and to help the youngsters. And we do know, evidence is overwhelming, that if you're abused as a child, sexually abused, your potential for abusing as an adult is really very significantly higher. And so by not actually solving the problems in one generation, we may be creating them for the next.
Again, I was a younger man than my colleagues.
And what do you think you would have done if some evidence of that nature had come to light in the Whip's office? And
well, if the Whips and all the rest had said, no, we can't do anything about this, I don't know what I'd have done, to be honest. I mean, it's easy for me to sit here and say, ooh, I've said I'm resigning, I'm protesting and all this. Well, that's easy to say now. The idea that a comparatively newly elected, a bit wet behind the ear, frightfully keen new member of Parliament, I don't know what I'd have done, really. Fortunately, the dilemma never arose. We didn't have anything of that kind in my day.
Right. Mr. Clark, thank you very much for coming.
Okay, as I said before I came, I've never had any factual knowledge of any case of paedophilia, either in the House of Commons or anywhere else, so I'm sorry I can't help you more, but that's my position.
I don't have any questions for you. It may be that the Chair or panel have some.
Thank you. Yes, Ms Sharpling first.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Just one question from me, if I may. When you were part of the Whip's office in your early career, did your fellow Whips share the same sort of philosophy that you've just described to us today? Or were there different approaches to the job?
Well, we were all ages, practically, and a great wide range of opinions. So I'm a social liberal, so I was almost pretty well a creature of the 1960s, born earlier, but obviously as a young man in the 60s, we had the beginnings of today's rather more liberal attitudes. Oscar Merton probably didn't share those. He was a stern old right-wing Tory. But the whole point of the Whip's office was it was representative of the party as a whole. Oscar was a great guy, he was very good company, and Oscar just, I'm sure, had rather different judgments to me on quite a lot of things, as well as shades of political opinion. We were both Tories, but very different sorts of Tory. No, my attitude's not universal. I think I was part of the new wave of members coming in the 70s. We were the post-war, rather more meritocratic, rather more very group of members that began to come in after from 70 onwards, really. And the two political parties had rather more stereotyped membership before that. It was the kind of people on both sides were more divided by class and more divided by background and divided by attitudes as well.
Thank you very much.
Just continuing Ms Sharpling's point, may I ask if Whips would always report to the police anything of a potentially criminal nature they might discover?
Well, I would hope so, but I don't know. I genuinely don't remember an example where that dilemma applied. I personally would have objected if we reported to the police someone engaging in homosexual activity, because even at those days, again, with my 60s attitudes, I thought it was utterly ludicrous that a homosexual act was a criminal offence. And we're asking hypothetical questions, but I give you at least a sexual illustration of where I might probably have thought I couldn't see any point in reporting this to the police, quite honestly. Indeed, I would have been strongly against it.
And what do you think the position would be now with the Whips?
Oh, in the present atmosphere, I suspect any Whip who gets any evidence of any criminal activity gets the police in pretty quickly, otherwise everybody's looking for conspiracy theories and celebrity scandals and all the rest of it on a slightly ludicrous scale. I mean, we've had a... I'm sure this inquiry is conducting a perfectly serious inquiry, but I just read now of ludicrous things about sex orgies in Dolphin Square and all the rest of it, and establishment conspiracies to cover up, both of which I regard as internet ridiculous nonsense. But you know, the President Whip's office will be sensitive to all that, so I'm sure they'd be off to the police if someone admitted shoplifting at the drop of a hat.
Thank you, Mr. Frank.
Just one matter of little detail, really. The book that you described as either the dirt book or the black book, as it's sometimes, but I mean, people might have all sorts of different ideas of what this really amounts to. Presumably, when you joined the Whip's office, whatever book it was already had some entries in it.
Yeah.
And when you left, was it the same book, or was there more than one book, or was a cupboard full of books?
I can't actually remember. I can't clearly remember what it looked like. I suspect we got a new book when we filled up the last one. It was a sort of... and I really can't remember much of the content. We are going back over 40 years here.
We are indeed.
And there was just continuously a book, and I gather there still is, I think.
And as far as you're aware, does the book still exist, or has it been disposed of?
That was up to the Chief Whip. Again, you've got two Chief Whips following me. I never became Chief Whip, but they will know better than me. My understanding, I think, was that because we didn't want this to go into the archives, they were the property of the Chief Whip. And the Chief Whip would take them off. And I seem to remember stories of some Chief Whip long before my time solemnly burning them in his garden when he got home. Now, that was not because they were full of lurid scandals of orgies and crime and all the rest of it, but because we had actually put down political gossip about half our colleagues, sometimes things, you know, colleagues being extremely critical of other colleagues and things that, you know, would have annoyed the person we knew were writing it. Most Chief Whips might have disposed of the Black Book because they never wanted their friends, their former colleagues, to realise some of the stuff that the Whips had put in the book about them. Because I stress again, the purpose of the book and the purpose of the Whip's office was political. We're not just a collection of people who, you know, just liked collecting salacious gossip. You could read the news of the world for that, if that was your particular interest.
Yes, thank you very much. That's all I asked.
Thank you. We have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Thank you very much.
Chair, the next witness is Lord Jopling.